In the last episode, I showed you how to use ActiveResource to communicate between multiple different Rails applications. For example, here I have a store application with multiple different products, and I also have a blog application with different posts. And what ActiveResource allows me to do is assign a specific product from our store application to a post in our blog application. So I'm doing that using, like I said, ActiveResource, and here's our product model inside of our blog application, and notice it inherits from ActiveResource. And as long as I set the site URL to the URL to the store application, then it can communicate with that using XML and treat it as a resource. Okay, in this episode I want to show you some more advanced features with ActiveResource and how to make the most out of that. The first thing I want to show you is authorization, because you may not want to allow the public users to have access to the same thing that ActiveResource has access to. So let me jump over to the store application here, and it's the products controller. And notice I have this before filter authorize in here. So I've already set up some authorization here, and I'm doing that with HTTP basic authentication. And notice I just set it to some static strings for now to keep it simple. And if you want to know more about this approach, it's new in Rails 2, you can look back in episode 82, I show it more in detail there. But so how do we communicate the username and password from our ActiveResource? And that's actually really easy to do. All you have to do is put the username and password in here, in the URL to the site, just like that. And then using HTTP, it will communicate that to the store application. And you'll likely want to use HTTPS here because otherwise the password will be sent in plain text. But I'm just going to stick with normal protocol just to keep it simple. Okay. Some other things I want to show you, I'm going to jump into Script Console for that. So it's a really great way if you want to just experiment with something like ActiveResource. Just open up the console. I highly encourage it because it's a really powerful tool to just get to know your development environment. So, as before I showed you, you can do a find all on a resource, and that will, down here you can see this is the request that's being performed on the store application, and this console is inside of our blog application here. So as you can see, it just does a GET request on the products action there, products index. And let's say I want to add some parameters to this GET request. That's pretty easy to do. Product.find all, and passing a params option. I can do, let's say, search for the word table. And this happens to be some functionality that I added to the index action in the products controller, and that way it returns only the product with the word table in it. And notice it added the query there in the URL. Okay, what else? We can also create a product. So let's do product.create, just like you would an active record model. So that creates a new product for us. It does a post request on the product's URL. And let's jump over to our site here and reload. And there's our new product on the application. So we can also update it. Save that, and when we save it, it does a put request on that specific resource. And we can reload here and notice the name changed. Alright, we can also destroy it, of course. Destroy it, and likewise that does a delete request. Okay, so what if we have some RESTful actions which aren't really RESTful? They aren't the specific CRUD operations on the resource. And back in episode 35, I showed you how to perform a custom RESTful action added to your routes. So let me show you that. I have a couple here in our products controller. I have a recent action and a discontinue action. And if you look in our routes file, you can see its recent action is set up as a collection. So that means it's treated on multiple products as a resource, multiple resources. and that's as a GET request. And I also have a member action set up here called discontinue, and that's a put request that it accepts. And that means it just acts on one specific resource. So how do we access these different actions from ActiveResource? Well, it's actually really easy to do. So let's jump over to the console again real quick. And if we do a product.get and then just call recent on this, just pass recent as a symbol, it will call the recent action there. And let's fetch a product real quick. Let's just fetch one. And then if we want to call discontinue on this specific product, we can just call put, because it accepts put request, and just call discontinue on that. And that will just call put on the discontinue action for that specific resource. So that's how you handle custom RESTful actions in ActiveResource. And that's really it for this episode. Let me show you real quick a couple things that you can do if you want to customize ActiveResource a little bit. Now I'm just setting the site variable here, but there's some other variables you can set. You can set the prefix variable if you want to set a path that goes between the URL and the resource, for example. Let's say you want to change the name of the resource, so it's not product, it's something else. You can set the element name, which will be the singular name of the product. We can set it to item, for example, or we can also set the collection name, and we can set that to maybe store items, and that will be the plural version of the name of the resource. So that's some different variables you can set in your product resource. But if you're sticking with conventions, usually you can just pass the site URL like that and have it all work for you with ActiveResource. And that's it for this episode. In just a couple days, Railscast will be turning 1 year old. It seems like just yesterday I recorded the first episode, but it was actually on March 5th of last year, looking back at it now. So the first year anniversary coming up, that's really exciting. But I think even more exciting is that episode number 100 is just around the corner. So what I'm going to do is on the 100th episode is throw a big contest for you guys. So if you want to help out with the contest, I'm looking for anyone to help donate prizes or sponsor the contest. If you're interested in that, you can send me an email at ryan@railscast.com. And for everyone else, you'll know the details of the contest on the 100th episode, and feel free to participate. This episode is sponsored by Peepcode. Please visit peepcode.com and check out their latest screencasts on Ruby on Rails. In this episode, we're going to take a look at active model serializers. This can be used to generate a JSON API in Rails. Let's try it out. Here I have a pretty standard blogging app with multiple articles, and each article has many comments. So what I want to do here is provide a JSON API to go along with this HTML view, so if I append the JSON extension in the URL, then I should gain access to the article's data. But right now I'm just getting this exception because our Rails app doesn't respond to the JSON format. That's easy enough to fix by going to the articles controller show action, which is what is being rendered, and let's add a respond to block here and provide the HTML format and the JSON format, and let's specify to render the JSON data of the article model. And now when I reload the page, I get that article's data in JSON. It works. So this is a pretty common way to generate a JSON API in Rails. However, you often need to further customize the output. You can do that by either passing options through here in the controller or overriding the asJSON method in the model, but both of those get messy pretty quickly. This is where tools like the Active Model Serializer gem come in handy. So let's go into the bottom of the gem file here and add the Active Model Serializers gem, and then you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. This gem provides a serializer generator, which you'll want to run for each model that you want to present through the API. If you're using the resource generator in Rails, it will make this automatically. So let's make an article a serializer. This just generates one file in the newly created app serializers directory. So now we have a dedicated class that we can use to fully customize the JSON output. And what's cool is that the gem includes hooks so that when we try to render out a model in a JSON format, it's going to automatically look for a serializer with the same name. So this will automatically detect the article serializer class and use that to render out the JSON format. In this class, we can specify which attributes we want to include in the output. Let's say the ID, name, and content of the article. Now, after restarting my Rails app and reloading this page, I get the format rendered out through active model serializers. Now, you may have noticed there's one key difference here, and that is that all the attributes are included in a root node called article, which differs from how Rails generates JSON by default. Now, you may not want this behavior depending on how you want the API to be consumed. You can disable the root node by passing in the root option and setting it to false. And now reloading the page, we no longer have that root key. Now, if you want it to always behave this way everywhere, you can define a method called default serializer options and then set the root option or anything else in there. And then the active model serializer will automatically take that up, so you could move this in the application controller so inheritance includes it in every place. I'm not going to do that here though, we're just going to stick with the default behavior of including the root node. Next, let's go back to our serializer class and see how we can further customize the output. Perhaps we want to add some attributes into here which are not really methods defined on the model. For example, maybe we want to add the URL to the article in here. Well, we can define that as a method on the serializer, and it will use that instead of delegating to the model. We also have access to the URL methods in here, so we can say article URL, and then pass in the object, which is going to be the model that this serializer is focused on. And reloading this page, and we include our URL attribute in our JSON output. I really like how you can just customize the attributes through methods like this. Something else cool about the serializer is its support for associations. If we want to include the comments data in here, we can just say has many comments because our article model has many comments. And now our JSON data includes the comments within our article attributes. And as you might expect, we can customize the comments attributes by generating another serializer called comment. So here's that generated serializer file, and let's just keep this simple and include the comment ID and the content. And reloading our JSON format, and our comments just include that output. So this is pretty cool. If a serializer class isn't found, it's just going to fall back to the Rails default serialization behavior. That means we can just add serializers as we need custom behavior. Now, so far, this comments data has been nested within this root article node. However, what if you don't want that? What if you want the comments data to be up at the root level as well? You might want to do this for performance reasons on some JavaScript client-side frameworks. We can customize that in our article serializer by calling embed and then specifying IDs here. So that means any associations is just going to include the IDs within the article. However, we can tell it to include the comments data as well at the root level. And reloading this page, now our comments data is included at the top here, outside of our article root node, and we have our comment IDs attribute now, which includes those IDs. So this way we can keep our comments data separate and maybe only include it as needed, but it really depends on how you want the API to be consumed. Now, what if there are some attributes that we want to include conditionally? For example, let's say we want to add an edit URL, but only if the user is currently an admin. Well, we can't really do this through the attributes call here, but we can override the attributes method, and whatever hash is returned from here is going to be converted to the JSON output. So if we want to keep our current behavior, we can call super to grab the data hash, and then we can just return that, and then modify it however we want. So let's add an edit URL attribute, and let's do the article URL here and pass in the object. Now I want to make this conditional, but let's try it out so far. Reloading our page, and we get our edit URL output here. So now we just need to make this conditional and only include it if the current user is an admin. However, the serializer is outside of the controller and view layers, so we can't simply say current user.admin here. To get around this problem, there's an object that's passed into every serializer called scope, and that defaults to the current user object. Let's give that a try, and we get this exception saying no method error, admin on nil, so scope is not set to the current user here for some reason. The issue is with how I have the current user method defined in my application controller. Here's that current user method, and for now I'm just simply stubbing out the current user object using OpenStruct, which is kind of a handy way if you're just in the middle of development and don't want to add some authentication into your app. Anyway, this method is defined as private, which prevents ActiveModel Serializer from detecting it. So we could just change this to a protected instead, and let's try that. Reloading this page, and now it works again, and it doesn't include the edit URL because a current user is not considered an admin. So far, our serializer is working well, but I do have a few issues with how the scope works. One problem is that it's going to load the current user record every time it makes a JSON request in our application, even if the user record isn't accessed in the serializer. That can result in unnecessary database queries and potential performance issues. Another issue I have with this is that the name scope is so generic, it's not really obvious here that the admin method is called on the current user. Instead, I would much prefer if we can just call current user directly from here. To get this to work, we can customize the scope object that's passed into our serializers by going into the application controller and calling a method serialization scope and telling it to use something other than the current user, such as a view context. So this way we'll be able to call our current user through this view context and any other helper methods that we might need to access within our serializer. Now to finish this up, let's go back to our serializer and tell it to delegate the current user method to the scope, which will be the view context. So now if I reload this page, it has the same functionality, but our current user is now only loaded in as needed. Now one downside with this approach is that it can make testing a little more difficult because you need to provide access to the entire view context for the serializer. To get around that problem, you might want to test it similar to how you would test helpers in Rails by inheriting from action view test case if you're using test unit. This will automatically set up the view context for you so you can pass it into the serializer. Now I want to finish up with one more thing here, and that is what if we want to generate this JSON data outside of a JSON request? For example, on our articles index page here that will list out the articles, let's say we want to embed the JSON data for all these articles within the page itself. Well, here's that index template listing out the articles, and I often embed JSON content within a data attribute on a tag in the HTML. So let's call this data articles, and then set the content to the rendered version of the JSON. And this can be a little bit complex here, so I prefer to move this off into a helper method. Let's call it a JSON4, and then pass in the object that we want to serialize, in this case the articles relation. Now to save us some time, I'm just going to paste this method into the application helper, called JSON4, and accepts a target object, whether this be an active record relation or a model. And it sets the scope option for our serializer to self, so that's the view context, and a URL options because this is important to pass in so we don't get any errors about our host option being undefined. And then next we call ActiveModel Serializer on the object that's being passed in. And this is a method that the gem adds to relations and models so that we can determine what serializer it should use. So we create that, pass in those options, and convert it to the JSON format. And now if we reload our page and view the source, our article data is passed in here using the serializer to generate it. Cool. And that wraps up this episode on ActiveModel Serializers. I encourage you to also check out episodes 320 and 322 where I cover JBuilder and Rabble respectively. Those generate JSON a little differently by utilizing view templates instead of serializer objects. I do think there are benefits to both approaches. I like the object-oriented nature of ActiveModel Serializer. However, I also do like the JSON serialization to happen more in the view layer. There's no wrong answer here though, so just check out each option and see which one you prefer to generate your JSON APIs. Thanks for watching. In this episode, we'll take a look at ActiveAdmin. This gem here allows you to easily add an admin interface to your application. And not only does it look really great, but it's also very customizable. And they provide a live demo so you can check it out and see exactly how it all works and the way it looks. But here, let's dive in and see how to add it to an existing application. So here's the application we'll be working with. We have an e-commerce style app where we have many products, and each one has a price, and it also belongs to a specific category. So there's a belongs to association here. and we want some kind of admin interface to manage these products. So let's use ActiveAdmin here. The first step is to go to your gem file and add the ActiveAdmin gem there. And notice that this is a Rails 3.1 application, and if you're using ActiveAdmin with Rails 3.1, then make sure you also use the Sass Rails gem because ActiveAdmin depends on this. If you're using a 3.0 application, then you don't need to include Sass Rails. And then run the bundle command to install the gem, and then run the Rails generate ActiveAdmin install command to install the necessary files to get it set up. Now notice that this command also provides further instructions for some additional setup, such as adding the host option to your mailer config in the development environment, making sure you have a root URL, and adding your notice and alert options in your layout file. Now, I've already done all of this in this application, so I don't need to do this setup. Now, that command also generated some migrations, so make sure you run the migrate command to handle all of those. Now, if you check out the ActiveAdmin documentation, you'll notice that it generates an initial user with this information, and you can use this to log in initially. Now, you may want to customize this functionality, and you can do that inside of the migration file that was generated. So if we point our browser to localhost port 3000/admin, we should get a login form where we can type in that initial user information. Let's check Remember Me and say login. So here's our fancy admin interface, but currently it doesn't have much. We know we want to manage products, so let's first add our products resource here. And we can do that by running Rails generate ActiveAdmin resource and then pass in the name of the resource, in this case, product. And you'll notice that this simply generates a products.rb file under the app-admin directory, and that's where you can go to customize how it works. So now when we go back to our admin interface, you can see we have an option here for products here in the top. And notice that this is a fully featured admin interface for managing our products that was just created instantly. And we have options to sort the products by various attributes. We can even filter them by any attributes. And notice that it automatically detected our belongs to association here because our product belongs to a category. So we can select a category and just filter the results based off of that. Really, really cool. And that works as well when creating new products. We can select a category that it belongs to, automatically all set up for us. But now what if you want to customize any of this functionality? Well, that's quite easy to do as well. Let's start off by customizing this index page here and maybe trimming down the number of columns that we have present on this products list here. To do this, we just have to go to the app admin products file that was generated earlier and then customize this through simple Ruby code. And you just make a call to the index method and then pass it a block if you want to customize that index page there. And you can specify any number of columns you want here. So we can have column name, that'll be the product's name. We can say we want the category. We can say we want the released at attribute and the price here. So we'll have those 4 columns in our index page. So now if we reload our products page, you can see that it's just limited to those 4 columns here. And notice that our category association was automatically detected here as well and filled in. Really nice. But what if we want to customize these a little bit further? Now, if you want to change the title of a column, you can just pass that in as the first argument. For example, this released at attribute here, we can say, maybe call it release date instead, and that'll show up as the title of that column. If you want to change the contents of the column, like the values for a given product, you can pass in a block. For example, our price column, I want it to be more formatted as a price, including the $sign and so on. So I can pass in a block here, and the product model for that given row will be passed in to that block. And I can return anything inside of here, and that will be returned as the value of that given column. Now we have access to the helper methods in here as well, so we can say number to currency, and then pass in our product price, and that will properly format the price like you would inside of a Rails template. So now if we reload this page here, you can see our release date column is properly titleized, and our prices have $signs in them. So that works. But you may notice that our price column here is no longer sortable because we customize the value that's returned. And also we don't have edit or destroy links here anymore. So let's fix that. So whenever you're using a block like this to customize the value, it's a good idea to pass in the sortable option so that you can tell ActiveAdmin how to sort it. So we'll sort by the price column, and we can add default actions call at the end here to add that show, edit, and destroy links. So let's reload the page, and that's looking really good. Now what if we wanted to change the alignment of our prices so they're all aligned on the right side of the column here? Now we could do the text alignment through CSS, but first we need some way to reference this price value through our style sheet. And ActiveAdmin provides a way to generate HTML that's very similar to Markaby. All you have to do is call the name of the tag that you want to generate. So if we want to generate a div here, just call div and then pass in a block, and whatever's returned from this block will be the content of that div. So we could put our price inside of here, and this way we can provide a class attribute on this div tag, and we'll just say price here, so that way we're able to reference our price value inside of here. And then any custom CSS code can go inside of the ActiveAdmin style sheet file under the app assets directory if you're using Rails 3.1. So inside of here, we'll just add a price call, and then we'll just text align to the right side there. So now when we reload our page, you can see that our prices are all right side aligned. Awesome. Another great feature of ActiveAdmin is scopes, and this is like a preset filter. So what you can do inside of your admin config is just call scope, and then pass in the name of a scope in your model, such as unreleased. And then we just have to make that scope inside of our product model. So let's call scope unreleased, and then say where our released at column is nil. So that way we have a quick way to access unreleased products. Now we can hit reload here, and you can see that we have our scope where we can just click on it and instantly access the unreleased products. Really neat. Now let's move on to customizing the way the dashboard looks, because right now it's empty, and it would be nice if we had maybe showing the most recent products here on this dashboard. We can customize the dashboard by going into the app admin dashboards file, very similar to how we customize resources. And notice that there's some nice documentation here in the comments. And we can just add a dashboard section by calling section here, and then passing a name such as recent products, and then passing in a block. Now let's say we want to put our recent release products in a table, and we could do that inside of ActiveAdmin by calling table4 and then passing in an array of products, such as product order by the released at attribute in descending order, and then limit it to the most recent 5, and then pass it in a block. And we can add columns inside of here exactly like we did inside of our index action. So we want a column for our name and a column for the released at attribute. And let's say we also want a link down here, maybe in a strong tag, saying view all products, and then linking to the admin products path. There we go. So if we reload our dashboard here, you can see we now have a list of the 5 most recent products, including the release date, and a link to view all the products. Awesome. It would be nice though if we had a link on each of these products' names that go to that specific product in our admin page. And to remember how to customize the value of a column, you just pass in a block just like we did with the price column. So we could say we want to pass in a block and our product is passed in here. So let's link to our product name, and call admin product path and pass in our product to link to it. Now there's a little tip here. If you're linking to a specific product, a slightly shorter way is just to pass in an array, giving an admin as a symbol as the first argument, and then just passing in the product, and that'll link to that specific product page as well. Reload our dashboard here, and our links look like they work. Yay! Now there is a gotcha to be aware of when working with ActiveAdmin in a Rails 3.1 application, and you can see that by going back to the main site. So we'll go to the main application here, and notice it doesn't look quite right, and that's because it's loading in the ActiveAdmin style sheet file here in our Rails 3.1 app. So the problem is that Rails 3.1 will include all style sheets by default, because in our manifest of our application CSS it says require tree, and it's going to include all of the style sheets here, but we don't want that. And really this isn't a good idea to do anyway because it's a better idea to have more control over the load order of your style sheets and so on. So instead of using require tree in Rails 3.1 app, I recommend just requiring each of the files individually, such as require products, and that will load just this current application CSS and our product style sheet. Now, an even better solution is to switch over to the Sass import command if you're using that. So, for example, here in our .css file, our application.css, we can switch over to Sass by adding .scss at the end, and then we can do away with the entire manifest at the top here and just use the import command and just say products like that. So that way we can import files specifically. The advantage of this is that we can access the Sass functions or whatever else we may define here. So let's try this out by reloading this page here. And hey, that works great because we're no longer including the admin style sheet. Now the last thing I wanted to show you here is how to do some global configuration, because there's another config file ActiveAdmin provides under config initializers directory here. And this allows you to do some more global configuration, such as changing the overall title of the site. So we could say it's Ryan's store here. And there's a lot of other options, but they're nicely documented here, so I'll leave it up to you to read that. Now you'll need to restart your server for that initializer config to take place, but if I reload here now, you notice that the store name is updated. And that about wraps up this episode, but there's so much more to ActiveAdmin that I haven't shown you here, so I encourage you to explore the documentation. You can customize the various filter options you supply. You can change the look of the show page here. You can add sidebars to this page. You can customize the form completely. It uses Formtastic internally, and so forth. Again, I encourage you to explore the documentation, and a really nice solution here. So check out ActiveAdmin. Back in episode 193, I covered how to create a tableless model. That is, I needed to use some of the features of ActiveRecord, but I did not want it to be backed by the database. Now, the technique I showed there is quite a bit of a hack because it's something that ActiveRecord wasn't designed to do. But now in Rails 3.0, we now have a feature called Active Model, which makes this much nicer. Now, before I get into the details of Active Model, let me first describe what we have in our application. So here's a contact us form, kind of a classic example of this, and that I created this contact form through a scaffolding. So there's a model called message, which is currently backed by ActiveRecord, which means we're currently managing messages through our database. But I don't want that. I want to make this a tableless model so that we're just sending emails through this form and not managing them in the database. Now, it's a good idea whenever you're in this situation to really double check yourself and make sure that your requirements are to have a tableless model, because there are often good side effects of storing the records in the database. It acts as a good backup. It also makes it easier to move the message sending into a queue and in a background process. But for these specific requirements and in this example, let's just make this a tableless model. Now, if we dive into the code of our message model, you can see that it currently inherits from ActiveRecord base, but we don't want that because we don't want it to have a database backend. So let's remove that. But now we have a problem. Our validation functionality will not work because that's what ActiveRecord provides us. So we need to pull that functionality back using Active Model. Now, if we take a look at the Rails 3 source code itself, you can see that Active Model is listed here right next to ActiveRecord. And so what the core team did is took everything in ActiveRecord that was not specific to the database backend and moved it out into Active Model. So ActiveRecord still relies heavily on Active Model for doing all this functionality that's not specific to the database, so that you know Active Model is well tested and fully featured, so it's great for you to use outside of ActiveRecord. So if we take a look at the contents of Active Model, you can easily see what functionality it provides, such as callbacks and dirty tracking and serialization and even validations, and this is exactly what we're looking for here. So if we take a look at the contents of this file, we can see the built-in documentation here, and you can see it's fairly easy to use. Basically just include the validations module and then just provide getter methods for the attributes which you're calling validations on. So going back to our message model, we can include that validations module and then add some accessor methods for our name, email, and content columns. Now this is enough to get our validation functionality working, but it's not enough to get our model to behave like our controller expects it to. So if we take a look at our controller, you can see right now it's just basic scaffolding where we create a new message passing in our attributes and then we try to save the message. But obviously this won't work now because we no longer have a database-backed model. So this new method here won't work because we don't have an initialize method which takes a hash of attributes. We can create that. And also save won't work obviously because we aren't trying to save the record anymore. Instead, let's just check if it's valid because we have some validations on our model. And then we'll just send it if it is. So the last thing we need to do is going back to our message model here is now define an initialize method which now takes a hash of attributes and we'll have it default to an empty hash. And so in here we just want to loop through all of these attributes and we have our name and our value for each attribute and we just want to assign the value which is passed in here. So we can use the send method to assign access that accessor method. We'll just say our name with an equal sign will be that access method. And we'll just assign our value to that. And so now each attribute that's passed into this initialize method will trigger that given setter method and assign that attribute. Now we can try reloading our page here and see if this functionality works. And oh, it doesn't. We get this mirror error message undefined method 2key on our message model, and that's inside of our form for call. So obviously Rails itself is expecting our model to have some functionality that it does not support. So we need to add that. Now, rather than guessing everything that Rails expects our model to include, there's a nice lint test included inside of ActiveModel, which allows you to easily check whether or not your given custom model behaves like Rails expects a model to behave. So you basically just include this lint test module into your test case, and that will check its functionality. You can see 2key here is already mentioned at the top and is actually a fairly short file, and there's really not a lot that Rails 3 models are expected to behave like. Now in this case here, we can easily get our lint test passing by including a couple modules. So the first one here is conversion, and this basically provides that 2key method and several others for converting it into various forms. So basically all you have to do is define this persisted method, which we're going to just have false because it's not a persisted model, and that way it can handle the 2key and 2param behavior properly. The only other module we need to add is the naming module, and actually you just extend this module because it adds some class methods, so you just extend that and that's all you have to do. So going back to our message model, we just need to add the conversion module and extend the naming module. And then finally just add the persisted method and have it return false, and that way our conversion module will know how to behave. So now if we reload our page here, hey, it's all working. And now our message model meets all the requirements that Rails 3 relies on in a model. We could even try submitting this form here, and you can see that, well, validations are working too. So this is all functioning properly. Now I've only covered a little bit of what ActiveModel provides you, but hopefully it's enough to get you started exploring it on your own. I just encourage you to download the Rails 3 repository, open up the ActiveModel directory, and just explore the various modules that it provides. And really it's well documented and well structured, so just find something you think you might find useful, just check out the code and you'll see a lot of documentation explaining how to get it up and running in your app. So whether you're building a simple tableless model like I did in this episode or a fully featured ORM, I encourage you to check out ActiveModel because it provides a lot of features that I think you'll find useful.